Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Rich Kahn. I'm Michele Shuster from McMurray and Schuster. Rich Kahn is with Anura. And this is something that Rich and I have been talking about doing for a while, getting a webinar together to talk about lead fraud and just kind of some of the implications of that and how it is something that folks really need to be aware of in this industry, how they can spot it, how they can prevent it, those types of things. So, Rich, thanks for agreeing for being on the webinar today.
No, thanks for having me. I enjoy these.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I wanted to let everybody know that you can ask questions during the webinar. There is a chat feature that you can go to, type in your questions, and we'll try to get all of those before the end of the webinar. If we don't, we follow up in email with the responses to those questions. So one way or another, we will get those responses to you. Also, if you would like to share this with others, this will be available on our website sometime in the next week. So check back for that, and you can get a recording of what we'll be talking about today. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, a disclaimer. While I am an attorney, and Rich works with a lot of attorneys, we will not be giving legal advice during this webinar, but feel free to reach out to us afterwards. We'd be happy to do that. So let's just kind of level set to start, Rich. This is something you and I have been talking about for a long time. I actually remember our first conversation. Ironically, it was in Las Vegas. And I think we were at a PACE event. Gosh, it's probably been 5 or 6 years ago. And you started talking about lead fraud. And it was something that was very eye-opening as far as the prevalence, especially back then. And sometimes I know folks are aware of it, but I don't think they're really aware of the potential impact and the prevalence of it. So, how big of a problem is this? What are you seeing out there?
It's growing really fast. The numbers that we have up on the screen here, just to give you an example, last year as a global society, I think the number was $640 billion was spent globally on digital marketing. And we're estimating, and we're being conservative, 140 billion lost to fraud. So, we don't tell people, it's like, do you have a problem? Is it, depending on what's going on, if you're buying traffic of any sort, you're part of this problem. You have this problem. It's just a matter of how big it is. And that will judge based on different, channels. Some channels have less fraud than others, but every channel we've tested has fraud, including organic traffic. So if you look at this chart is actually based on pretty realistic numbers. And you can see from 2020 to 2024, how it went from, I think that number was about 60 billion, just about 60 billion to 140 billion in just 4 years. I mean, it's growing crazy. And we'll get to a slide in here we predict for 2028, but it's a big problem, and it's, a lot of people don't like talking about it because, oh my God, they're going to affect my revenues.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that, like, if you're an agency and you're selling traffic to a client and you have some fraud mixed into it, you're just watering down the ROI, right? So if you water down the ROI, they smart price you, and they're only going to spend so much money with you based on what the results are. But if you actually clean up the fraud, their demand for your service goes up because their ROI goes up and you make more money in the long run. So it's a problem that people don't like to discuss, but it's a problem that if you address it, it'll transform your business. We just got a client actually email us, been with us a couple of years, and said how we literally transformed their business. They didn't realize it, and it was a 4-year sales cycle for that particular client.
Wow.
It was a bigger client, just dragging their feet, and finally they said, okay, let's give it a shot. And it's like, a couple of years later, like, I can't believe the difference it's made to our business. So I mean, addressing fraud is an important thing, or at least getting a beat on it. Like, how much fraud do you have? Like, if you ask most people that, they don't know.
Yeah.
They don't want to.
Go ahead, Rich. It's such a massive number, right? I mean, you think about that, and we're talking about 140 billion with a B, and that's larger than the gross domestic product of some of the small nations out there. So, it's not a trivial type of thing, which is why I was so interested in having this webinar and really helping you to get this information out there. So, I
One
take
thing,
it
I'm
that,
just going to go back real quick on that
oh,
last
sure.
one because I'm a storyteller, I like stories. I like to watch Shark Tank because I'm just an entrepreneur at heart, been doing it for years. And I love it when they get up there and they have this new product for this industry. And it's like, well, how big is the industry? Well, it's a $10 billion, $20 billion. So, and when they talk about it, it's like, oh my God, it's this $20 billion industry. We just want to crack that mark and get a little piece of it. And then I look at these numbers, I'm like, $140 billion of basically basic legal crime, because right now there's really no direct laws against ad fraud. So we all know it's stealing, but
Yeah.
show me a law in the books that says ad fraud's illegal. So they use other things like, wire fraud and, tax evasion or whatever. There's other rules that they get these people when they can connect, when they can identify them, but they can't always identify them.
Yeah, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end.
Yeah.
Because the issue is really for the purchaser of the leads, or usually the seller of the product. So they're a purchaser and a seller, but it is something that I think people try to protect themselves through contracts. And while that's a very important thing, and you always want to make sure that you've got good contracts with tight requirements and tight terms and indemnification and those types of things, it's not a fix to this problem. Because if you have systemic issues in your lead generation, those numbers get so large so quickly, especially with the TCPA when we're talking about $500 to $1,500 if someone's placing calls that they don't have the appropriate leads for. So it gets large very, very quickly.
Yep. So yeah, so this is just showing our 2024 data. So some of these slides that we're going to be talking about reference a fraud statistics of 2024 report that we're releasing. And at the end, there's a QR code so you can pre-register to download that. It'll be out in the next week or two.
Mm.
But this was something interesting that we found, is that during the holiday season, when spend is up, Q4 spend is up, digital marketing spend is up, the percentage of fraud is also up. So I guess the fraudsters want to get, have a good holiday season themselves. And they, for whatever reason, they ratchet up. We've been looking at this year over year, and this trend seems to be similar. Q4 is the biggest, Q1 is the second, and then kind of like the summer months kind of just lull. And this pattern's been pretty consistent over the last several years that we've been tracking this.
Mm. So this is what you were talking about with the projections that you're seeing for the future. I mean, the numbers really do become staggering.
Yeah, so we're looking at 3-4 years from now, we're looking at
Mm.
breaking the $200 billion mark. And again, I will continue to say our projections are conservative. Um, and when we did the research, just to give people some scale on that, that's more than Netflix and Disney plus revenue combined. So you're talking about massive companies, and yet this item of fraud is huge, and it's just a massive number that's hard to comprehend.
How are these numbers calculated, Rich? How do we put dollar amounts to those?
So essentially what's happened is we're looking at, the way we do it is we're looking at the total amount of spend digital marketing from all channels.
Mm.
So we get that from a couple different sources, or we get the right, and they're all pretty close to each other. So the 640 billion for last year was pretty on par with
Mm.
everybody was reporting. And then we're looking at calculations, and we're looking at calculations across our entire customer base to get some percentages. And it's kind of weird because we have to look at the percentages of when we first bring on a new client. So if I bring on a new client, the average fraud fine is 25%. Once they
Wow.
use our product, it starts to drop if they're taking active correction against it. So we have to look at, initially when we bring them on, and we kind of do that data. And I think last year we're coming in right around, you know, the way we did it, we normally find 25% fraud when we first do the initial trial to just gauge it. And then once they're on for the first month, I think that's the data that we pulled. And that averaged just about 22%, which is how this number was calculated for last year. Which is interesting. Like we were looking at, okay, we understand how big of a problem it is. What do we solve for our clients? And last year, we identified just about $2 billion in fraud for our clients personally.
Mm.
So to
Mm.
give you an example, it's a huge problem out there, and we're working towards helping more and more people, find the problem and solve the problem.
But what does that look like when you bring on new clients? What type of things are you doing to kind of hit the ground running and identify these issues that they have?
Yeah, the first thing is 9 times out of 10 when we talk to somebody, they're like, okay, I think there's a problem. They
Hmm.
feel something, right? Something is going on. And so the first thing we want to do is we drop a tag on their page. It's a simple JavaScript tag that they drop. We're pre-built into Google Tag Manager. So if they have Google Tag Manager, like 75% of the population does, takes 3 minutes with no technical lift to deploy it. Now we can actually monitor where the traffic's coming from and how much of a percentage of fraud they're identifying. So kind of just understand technology a little bit. The way we do it is we'll collect when a visitor lands on a page that we have our code on, we'll collect over 800 data points on the user's environment. So hardware, software, plugins, anything and everything. We know how the data is supposed to look, how it interacts with each other. And based on that, we can give a definitive thumbs up or thumbs down. And then we basically, in the initial thing, we when we're first doing the onboard, we want to identify how big of a problem it is. Does it make sense to move forward working with us? And where is it coming from? So like they walk away with some useful information, whether they work with us or not. But at least at that point, they can identify, wow, I've got, 30% fraud, multiply it by, the amount of money they spend each month. And they're like, okay, I'm already spending, for a company spending $1 million a month in digital marketing, 30% represents $300,000 that they're giving to fraudsters.
Yeah.
We want them
Yeah.
to know that number because that usually upsets people. Like I'm basically funneling money to organized crime is really where the majority of fraud comes from. And then it kind of upsets them and it's like, okay, how do we solve this? And that's how we jump in and we help them do that. If somebody had, I think the lowest we usually catch is around 5%.
Mm.
But a lot of people, when we're catching that, they have a lot of resources that they've already invested in trying to reduce the amount of fraud. So they might have, certain areas that they don't buy traffic from. And like they've been fine-tuning their campaign over long periods of time, backing it out to conversion data, and they're trying to get it down. And then like when we see 5%, we're like, they're probably not going to go with us. And like, nope, we want to get rid of that 5%. Because that
Yeah.
5% multiplied by $1 million, still $50,000 a month I'm spending. If I can get that, for a few bucks, figure out, get a tool to help me get rid of that, all the better. But what really comes into play is for lead generation because somebody at the end of the day is picking up and making a phone call.
Yeah.
Describe.
Yeah.
So fraud for us, and actually the average lead generation that we see is because lead generators use a variety of different channels. Um, that typically 1 in 4 leads are fraudulent. So imagine one of your clients, how many calls do they make a month? And we know, we just quick calculation, most of these guys are making a lot of calls. And if 1 in 4 of those calls are fraudulent, and what these fraudulent people are doing is they're using real people's information. So they use Michelle's information. They'll get her name, phone number, email address, whatever other information the form requires, fill it out, hit submit. Almost every lead generator takes it to a data validation to make sure that the information looks good, does some checks against, DNC lists and things like that, and then says, this looks good, I'm calling. And within seconds, Michelle's phone's ringing. And now what? First thing you say, if you answer the phone because you're not expecting the call from them, first question you respond is, well, I never filled out your form. TCPA violation. Number one, right? Now, what happens if they had to call you 10 times to try to get you on the phone because you don't recognize the number? And they're like, Michelle just filled out this form. I don't understand why she's not answering. They call you a bunch of times. Now, what happens if a lawyer gets involved in trying to create a class action suit? All they want to do is see disposition reports for the last 3 months, 6 months, year, whatever it is. Try to get a couple of other defendants together, create a class action lawsuit, which, as you know, TCPA class action lawsuits are the fastest growing class action lawsuits in this country. And
Yeah.
that's where it stems from because of these fraudulent leads.
Yeah. Especially this year, we're seeing record highs and they're increasing every month. I think you've kind of answered this question already, and I can probably add a little bit to this too. But the question was, what exactly are you referring to when you say fraud? Do you mean fake leads being entered? You answered that a little bit, but is there anything else out there?
Yeah, so so a fake lead is being entered by typically what we call is sophisticated invalid traffic, SIVT.
Mm.
So you're looking at advanced bots like AI bots, malware, which could be software installed in your machine that's injecting information on your computer on behalf of you, or human fraud farms. Human fraud farms are the least technical savvy way to do it because any one of us can go on the dark web, use a browser to get on the dark web, go search out these human fraud farms, tell them, here's my affiliate link, go fill out, hey, save money on car insurance. Here's a database of information, go fill it out. And they already know because what they're trying to do is make the IP bounce off of an IP address in that same city. So it all matches up, right? Spoof the device so it looks like it's different devices each time and fill out these forms by a human so it doesn't look like it's robotic if you're using some type of screen capturing technology to track it so it looks real. And it passes all the tests.
Mm.
And everyone thinks, wow, this is great. So for us, it's fraudulent activity. And let's face it, the other type of human fraud type activity it could be a competitor, right? Say a competitor wants to fill out your form a bunch of times. Well, they're not, I would like to think they're not dumb enough to come to your site, fill out a form 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 times to try to waste your budget using the same IP address and same user agent. So they'll maybe use a VPN service. So they'll use some type of, spoofing or cloaking system to make it look like it's real, because with the privacy laws in our country, you can't really track back those connections if they're done.
Mm.
So like you lose like a Tor browser. Tor browser gets you on the dark web. Tor browser bounces off of 5 international proxies before it actually hits the network. Now,
Mm.
your connection is slow as heck, but you'll never be able to trace back that original person because of the privacy laws.
Yeah. Do you get involved as an expert witness in cases ever, Rich, or do you work with folks that do?
I do.
Yeah.
I've been pulled
Yeah.
into a number of cases so far,
Mm.
asking and actually it was interesting, some to prove, you know, that the lead that was generated that was called was definitely ingenuine. I've actually had a client call us up, said they got sued, and we're like, what do you mean? Like, are you using our technology? They're like, well, we have your technology, but we're not blocking based on your technology. And what was the lead? So we pull up the lead that they got that sued for. It was one that we marked as bad. And
Mm.
like, well, this is the lead that we told you not to call. You called it anyway. So now, of course, they turn around and do it. They just start using the technology to block in real time. And then he had a client that somebody called up and we had to prove that they were actually good. So our technology was able to prove that it was an actually real visitor, and we were able to trace it back to the person's residence, and the IP address all matched up once we had all the data. But we were able to prove that it wasn't spoofed or anything else. It was it was somebody at that address that did it. So yeah, we get pulled in. I get pulled in a lot for that. In fact, I just got hit up with another potential case to get pulled into. So
How difficult is it to go back after the fact and try to recreate the information that would maybe demonstrate that it was a bad lead or some type of malintent from maybe even the lead generator that you're working with?
so here's where we get a little bit into the
Yeah.
weeds, right? So there, everybody's familiar with the IAB. It's the Internet Advertising Bureau. They kind of set the
Mm.
standards for everything, and they get together with the 4As and the ANA. And
Mm.
about a dozen years ago, they got together and they wrote internet standards for fraud detection companies because they've been popping up like crazy. And some of them do a decent job, or I should say, very few of them do a decent job. And the rest of them are really just out there to take people's money, put
Yeah.
on a good show and take people's money because we've seen the data, we've heard clients' horror stories with the data. It's just not accurate. And
Mm.
so they're mismarking real people as fraud, which cost them money, and they're mismarking fraud as real people. So it kind of defeats the purpose. But anyway, going back to it. So when they designed the standards, they didn't call it fraud. No one likes the word fraud. They call it IVT, invalid traffic. And then IVT is actually categorized into 2 different areas. We talked about SIVT, which is sophisticated invalid traffic, and then GIVT, which is general invalid traffic.
Mm.
So if you're going back to recreate, usually people collect enough information to do a GIVT scan. So a basic data center attack, known
Mm.
bots, um, the hit rate on that is going to be lower because it's just 2 data points. SIVT filter, like ours, I can't speak for anybody else's technology, but ours looks at over 800 data points. You're not
Wow.
going to be able to recreate that. We have to be able to pick that information up at the time the visitor is hit, lands on the
Mm.
website. So you can get a GIVT scan, but it's going to miss the more sophisticated types of attack, which is most of the time. I'll give you an example. Like, you guys familiar with programmatic advertising, display ads, TV ads, right?
Mhm.
So in order to purchase that type of traffic, you purchase through a DSP, a demand side partner. And in the DSP, they'll all claim that they use a fraud detection solution. What they're not telling you is they use it on the pre-bid solution in that magic 100 millisecond auction, and it's a GIVT filter, and it catches 1 to 3% of fraud. So they'll tell you that their traffic is clean. It's 1 to 3% fraud. Every client that I've tested that uses, and I don't care what DSP it is, even the more popular ones, publicly traded ones, doesn't matter. Everyone I test averages 50% SIVT fraud.
It's unbelievable.
So same situation. If you were to go back, you might get lucky and catch that it was a bad lead and there might be some details there. So it's worth checking it. But recreating an SIVT scan is just not possible with most people's
Yeah.
data.
Yeah. This isn't really something we prep for, but I'm going to throw it out to you anyway. So, because I just think it's really interesting. And so I think a lot of people would like to know, okay, so it's great that we can detect this once we've started working with someone to provide lead information for us. But, doing that due diligence up front, which we get involved with frequently, but mostly in terms of contracting, right? Making sure we have good contract provisions in there and we define what a good lead looks like and what type of actions we won't tolerate, always indemnification provisions in there, those types of things that you can protect by contract. But when you're doing the due diligence on a lead generator, is there anything you can do to help at that point before you even start working with them? And I'm sure some of that might be because you've had experience with previous customers and may not be able to share that type of information. But pre hiring somebody, is there anything you can do to help folks?
Yeah, so if you're about to hire somebody to generate your leads,
Mm,
step one is you want to make sure in your provision that you're not paying for fraud. And
mm.
define fraud as simple as not, I'll leave that to the legal people to design. I'm not a legal person, but
Yes.
I once had a client, stop referring to it as fraud, just started referring to it as a non-consumer. So
Uh,
but at the end of the day, it's you have to design, you have to just now I have a definition of fraud um that talks about fraud in specific. I don't know if it would be a legal
mm,
definition, but it's really at the end of the day, a fraudulent lead. And a lot of people will leave it pretty plain. I've had several clients at this point being with us for a few years actually put fraud as defined by Anura.
mm.
So we've had that in contracts. But like you need to have a definition that you're not paying for fraud. Uh,
Interesting provision in a contract, though, right? Because the one thing I've noticed, especially from my consumer protection days, is it's always changing, right? There's always a new and different method and evolving. So having those types of definitions that can change and evolve as well, I think is important.
That's why having good legal counsel is important
Mm,
in that contract when you put that together.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
the other thing I do too is um, I'm a lead buyer, right? At the end of the day, I'm trying to buy leads to grow my business.
mm,
So I've come across this. I can't tell you how many times because I'm always trying to find another place where we can, because we'll hit our numbers every year, but it's like, okay, how do I hit numbers next year? Now I'm
mm,
working on that today, Q1, Q2 on how to hit numbers for next year. So I'm trying lots of things. I get, sometimes I'll bite on a bulk email. Somebody sends me a bulk email. I'm like, what makes you different? And it's like, okay, it sounds interesting. I want to test you out. My recommendation, I always tell them the same thing. I bought from a company. I'm not going to mention the name, but they are very large lead generator, probably one of the largest in the space.
mm.
Um, I told them what I'm looking to do. They said, no problem, we can do it. Gave them the campaign, and the first three leads came in, and the second lead on the list was Pepsi. I'm like, that's unusual. I wouldn't expect them to respond to an ebook invite,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
okay, let's because they were going to do an ebook invite and invite these people. And within 3 days, they had delivered like 60 leads. And I just looked down the leads and I'm like, this is too good to be true. This has got to be fraud. I'm just looking at the data. It doesn't make sense. So I said, well, part of the requirement was on the landing page, it had to be running our code. So I jumped in the code and every single lead came from the same IP address out of a small town in India. Now, my requirement is that the person must fill out the form themselves. So obviously
Mm,
this didn't happen. And I was able to, even though the system it was a real person filling out the form, it was all coming from the same IP address, same user agent. I'm like, you have some call center that's just filling these out. These are not real. So we didn't pay for that. And I stopped working with the company. I've had companies that have worked with, companies that, they'll get, I actually have an interesting story. I had a customer use our technology. Half the leads that were being submitted to them were fraudulent, and they wouldn't call them because they knew the technology was accurate and they were looking at it from that angle. So the person on the other end of the phone said, the seller of the leads said that no, they're good leads. We know they're good. We generate them good. So the client told them, fine, I want you to call them and I want you to record the calls. And then we're going to discuss afterwards, after we review the call recordings, what's going on.
yeah,
And they made like a handful of phone calls and understood it. They were no good.
yeah,
They
yeah.
were, they played one of the recordings and our client was able to listen to it. And the person swore up and down. They didn't fill out a form. and it was and they mentioned a TCPA, a lawsuit, and it was an ugly call when they realized. So the seller discounted the 50%, and then the seller called us.
Yeah.
So it was interesting.
Yeah, that's something we're going to talk about here in a little bit too. Kind of those things that you see on the other end of it when you're not catching it up front. I was intrigued by this slide. This is not something that I think is intuitive. 79% of the Netherlands had the highest, with 79%, the Netherlands had the highest bad traffic rate. I think of the countries where we have seen cases that have had issues, and Netherlands is not one I would have put at the top. What do you attribute that to?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
And it is funny because I look at the data. So when I'm sitting down with my developers who took over the code base from me, like years ago, decades ago, I sit down and I look at, okay, is this visitor real? Like what
Mm,
I'm looking at this visitor, what can I come back from that, can point to me the fact that they're not real. I never summarize the data. So our marketing team
mm.
wanted to start summarizing data and put out a fraud report talking about all the different trends that we found. So they picked out a bunch of stuff, and this came up on the slide, and I'm like, wow, this I would never guess it. But now I understand the technology too. It's possible that the fraud actually emanated from another country,
Yeah.
bounced off of the Netherlands, and then went to the United States, and we picked up a US IP address. But our technology can look at the previous IP, the previous hop, look at that address, and that's where it came from. So
Mm.
it's possible that that's
That
what
would make
happened.
sense.
I'm pretty probable that's what happened, but it was interesting because we look at all the countries, and it was the Netherlands had the highest level of fraud. It was just weird.
This is one I was not surprised by, that the Philippines has 83% clean traffic. I've done a few audits of call centers in the Philippines, and they take this very seriously. It's a large percentage of employment and income in the Philippines, and having a call center job in the Philippines is considered a really great and high-paying job. And most of the call centers are in Makati, which the government really protects. I was there doing an audit in the middle of a coup, and you would have never known it in Makati that there were these crazy things that were going on outside. But is that what you kind of attribute that to as well?
I kind of felt it would be. Like I said, there's a lot of like each country treats things a little different. Like there's
Mhm.
countries out there that they harbor fraudsters. They know it. They have special laws to protect them,
Yeah,
and then knowingly do it. And some of the stuff that they're doing of these are just sickening
yeah,
to the average person. The type of stuff that they allow hosted out there. But the Philippines is more and more of the upstanding
yeah.
areas. And it wasn't surprising when I saw this one. Like I said, oh, okay. Like if you asked me to guess which country, I wouldn't have guessed it. But when I saw it, it kind of made sense.
Yeah, yeah. I think the chambers get very involved in the Philippines too. They have a lot of very active, what we would call the Chamber of Commerce, which are similar to that in the Philippines. And so I think there's a really big business push too to make sure that that industry is protected. So kind of it does make some sense there. I also found this really interesting too about all of the major mobile operating systems being associated with this. And I guess I wasn't so surprised about Android having the most fraud, but I'd love to understand kind of what's behind those numbers.
Sure. So two reasonings behind it. First off, when fraudsters write code to do something, they go after the biggest market.
Mm,
So for years, they would attack Windows devices over Macs because they just dominated the marketplace. Android has about a 60% market share over iOS, which is about 40%.
mm,
So it makes sense that they want to go after the bigger market share with one piece of code. The second thing that does is Android has a much more open architecture for app
mm,
development. So basically, I can write an app, put it into the Google Play Store, it gets scanned, and within hours, it's now available for people to download. So people can write malware inside their code and have it get past the scanner. So by writing their code in such a way they can trick the scanner, it's out there and there's nobody to stop it. It's just up and running unless somebody reports it. iOS is a little different. So basically, they still have the same scanning process, but then it goes into a human review queue, which could take a few weeks. So as an iOS developer, it takes a while to get an update out or a new app out because it has to go through human review. So
mm,
and that human review is hopefully picking up the stuff that the general scanners are missing.
mm. Very, very interesting. Yeah. So what is the real cost of lead generation fraud?
So we put this up just to give a couple things because lead generators a lot of times use affiliate marketing. It's one of the
Yeah,
channels that they like to use, and it's on average we catch affiliate marketing channels at 45% fraud. We talked about programmatic. Programmatic is the highest level, and it's also, again, it's the biggest single channel of marketing. So fraudsters will attack that. There's more dollars spent there than in any other channel, any
interesting.
other single channel. At one point, it used to be 80% of the marketing, but I think that's changed a lot. I haven't seen a recent report on what the percentage of programmatic accounts, but it's still one of the largest marketing channels. And of course, so fraudsters, again, they want to go after the big hit, big fish. Affiliate marketing at 45% is just you're paying somebody to do something. You're paying someone to look at an ad, click on a link,
Yeah,
fill out a form, make a credit card purchase, and it's just ripe with fraud. So look at credit card purchasing, right? An affiliate typically gets paid net 7, net 15. They get paid fast because that's a requirement of affiliate marketing. I want to get paid right away. But a credit card chargeback could take months. I had a client that was doing 30,000 airline tickets a day through their e-commerce platform. And they said they pay out their affiliates net 15, but it could take up to 9 months before they get the chargeback data back to their system and then try to relate it. And by then, they've already paid this affiliate for months before they disappear. And then, of
yeah.
course,
You know what's interesting about that is the regulators really monitor chargebacks. And if a regulator sees a company with a chargeback, they would say anything that exceeds 1 or 2% is too high. I don't think any businesses out there would agree with that, but they literally monitor these on a monthly basis. And frequently enforcement action determinations are made in large part to those types of things because they figure that if consumers are charging back for the products, then there's something wrong either with the way that they advertised or sold it or with the product itself. And it can lead to some pretty significant issues, even above and beyond the types of issues that we're talking about today.
oh yeah, so when a lot of reasons we work with a lot of e-commerce companies
Mhm.
because if their chargeback gets too high, they get hit to a higher rate,
They
or
sure
they have to
do.
move to a risky merchant account that'll hold it, or they lose their merchant abilities altogether. And
Mhm.
now if you're an e-commerce business with no merchant capabilities, you're pretty much out of business.
Yeah, yeah, that's problematic for sure. That is problematic for sure. So, we've talked about this already, and you've alluded to these types of things, but just kind of, pulling this all together as to the type of fraud that you're seeing out there, and just the one thing I would add to the types of things that we're talking about, and this is something that we've been involved in, multiple pieces of litigation about, and this is the callers that are placing outbound calls and then transferring those to the lead purchasers and representing that those were inbound calls that came in. And we were involved in a pretty significant case last year around this issue. And it was really as much fraud against the company that was accepting those inbound calls as it was for the consumers. And so there was a pretty large judgment that came out of that that involved the seller. But in that same case, and in countersuing the lead generation company that had, misrepresented what those calls were, we were able to get a pretty sizable judgment against them as well. Now, collecting on those is a little bit more difficult. But it did avoid a lot of liability for our clients. So it's interesting to see that kind of lead fraud out there as well, and it happens pretty frequently.
So they were basically making cold calls, getting somebody on the
Making
phone.
cold calls using pre-recorded messages, but then phrasing it so that when the consumer answered the telephone, it made it sound like that they had just made an inbound call, and so the recordings were altered, so we were able to establish that, and yeah, it was pretty problematic all the way around. But it just really it goes to show kind of what we started talking about in the beginning is that it's so important to do that due diligence and then also to do audits along the way with the type of stuff that you're talking about, but then also just making sure that if you're accepting calls as inbound, going through and monitoring those pretty regularly and reviewing a pretty significant amount of those call recordings to make sure that there's not anything unexpected in those recordings or something that would tend to indicate that it was an outbound call rather than an inbound call that had been transferred. Do you see that very often? Is that the type of stuff you get involved with, or really outside of what you do?
Because it's an offline transaction to
Mhm.
us, we don't really get involved. But we did have a client. What they did was they had a bunch of small clients that they sold to. So like roofers and electricians and house and plumbers and things
Mhm.
like that. And each of these had like just a landing page with, company logo, maybe a picture of the person who owns the business, name, address, phone number on the page, right? And the way they were buying traffic to the page from their affiliates was 100% affiliate network. They were
Yeah.
buying traffic on a price per click basis by judging the quality based on a connected call duration of
Mm,
2 minutes. So if they had 100 calls, if they had 100 clicks to the page, they were looking for some percentage of those to generate phone calls that lasted at
mm.
least 2 minutes. So the guy that normally ran it was on vacation, and his boss had gotten a bunch of complaints. So he's like, you know what? I'm clearing my deck for the week. And he listened to, he says, thousands of calls that week.
Oh,
And
goodness.
he started to pick up on a trend that he started picking up some weird, like some of them had heavy accents,
Mm,
claiming that they had a card. He says, okay, a lot of Americans have heavy accents, not a big deal. And then he goes, the one that kind of tipped his hat is somebody called an auto parts store looking for a part for a car, and he never heard the name and the make and model of the model of the car. It was a Ford, I think it was a Ford, and they gave a name. I can't remember the name. And so he had to look it up, and he found out it's the type of, so it's a Ford Taurus at the time, but it was renamed in India as a
oh,
different brand.
interesting.
So now he's calling up thinking he's talking, to a local parts supplier, and now he's starting to put things together. So we helped him scan the clicks that came in
Mm,
before they made the phone calls, and we're able to list all the data, and we were able to do it within seconds versus him spending all week listening to thousands of phone calls and identify the issues he was having. So those type of calls we
really
get involved,
interesting.
but when they're totally offline, it's something that our technology is not set up for.
Yeah, yeah, makes total sense. So, I mean, I think the risks of lead fraud are pretty obvious. We've been talking about them, obviously, in the terms of wasted marketing dollars, the skewed metrics that you've been talking about. But I think the reputational damage is probably one of the more significant ones. You can recover from the financial aspects of this, but once you start getting a bad reputation, bad consumer reviews, that stuff really starts to affect the business's ability to effectively market and sell in any type of way. And then not to mention the potential for TCPA violations. It would be interesting to know, and I don't know of any statistics out there. It would be interesting if you know of any, Rich, but for the TCPA lawsuits that have been filed, what percentage of those have involved lead fraud? Have you ever done any types of studies around that?
I haven't.
We'll have to figure out how to do that.
Because again, the fraud that's happening, you've got some actually, you've got people out there that are serial litigators, right?
Mhm, of
And
course. Yeah.
that's the type of fraud where I haven't come across it yet, but I believe we would catch that because again, they can't do it from their direct location. They have to trick somebody into breaking
Yeah.
TCPA compliance. So that comes down to making sure you have a good, strong process on your side for collecting the lead information and making the outbound call. But I have no data on that at all. It'd be interesting to find that out though.
It would be interesting. It'd be interesting. And so just in general with the solutions that you have, though, it would pick up that as well, it seems like. If you have somebody that is, generating these calls by going out and filling out the forms. And you and I have talked about this a little bit and kind of the difficulties that you see around those types of things, just because of the tactics that they use to mask, where they're filling out those forms from, going to different locations to do it, having other folks do it, those types of things.
Hmm. Or
Yeah.
taking advantage of there's a lot of companies out there that now sell. Are you familiar with a residential proxy IP?
You and I actually talked about
Yeah.
that, only because you and I have talked about it. Yes.
So just so the audience knows what we're talking about, is there are companies out there that have access to 30 million IP addresses. And the way they get there is they give out free software, typically like
Mm,
VPN software. Here's free VPN software. And if you read the terms and conditions, which most people don't, it says that they can use your internet connection while you're connected to their service. So what they're doing is allowing other people to bounce off your IP address to mask their IP address as your IP address. So the problem with that is, let's say somebody was to do something that's suable by, like that's
mhm.
breaking the law. It's bouncing off your IP address. You're going to have questions to answer,
Yeah.
right? So it's important to look at some of these services that free software isn't always free.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen, brother. And definitely being aware of those types of things that are being downloaded for sure. This is one of those cases that, I think is kind of exemplar of the types of things that we're talking about. And in this Davis versus Clear Health case in particular, this is one where there was lead fraud involved. And, the types of things that you heard testified to in this case is that a lot of the folks that were answering these phone calls were saying, listen, I didn't ask for these calls, or it wasn't me that filled out a lead form, or I didn't visit your website. And so you were talking about your client that was listening to call recordings. And I think those are, it's kind of typical of the types of things that you will see if you're working with somebody that has a lead fraud issue.
Yeah, because it could, and it's possible, like in some situations, it's possible that somebody fills out a form
Mm.
and
And
then the
forgets.
lead generator now
Yeah.
sells that lead for
Yeah.
other purposes. And the person's like, no, I don't know what you're talking. Like, let's say they save car insurance and all of a sudden they're getting a call for, new
Yeah.
windows. I didn't fill out
Yeah.
your form, and they're right. But that kind
And
of,
that was kind of the case in this case. It was a job website, and the leads that were being sold to insurance companies. And so, when they were saying, I didn't go to that website, I don't know what you're talking about, I didn't ask for healthcare calls. It was because, you have the recording of the part of the website where the consumer is providing consent, but what you may not see is what the rest of that web page looked like at the time. And while it was being represented as a healthcare or a health insurance website, it was actually being put out there for people to provide information about future jobs.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Problematic, very problematic. So, when we talk about minimizing litigation exposure, and we've been kind of talking about this along the way, but it is so important to vet your lead vendors. And, we're not saying that all lead generators out there are bad, and the overwhelming majority of them are very good at what they do, and they provide credible, valid leads that give you the consent that you need for the types of calls that you're making. But it's really important to be able to distinguish between the ones that are that and the ones that are problematic, as Rich and I have been talking about during the webinar. And it's really important to go through and, what they're representing as the forms that they're using. You need to have a way that's to validate that. And, at the most basic level, make sure that the consent language is right. And I would really caution people about lists of marketing partners. I know that we have not had to deal with the implementation of the one-to-one consent rule or logically and topically related, but the law has been around for a very long time that those lead forms need to make it readily apparent to the consumer that they're providing their consent to receive a call about specific thing using specific technology. And at a bare minimum, if those lead forms don't do that, while it may not be fraud, it may be neglect, it's still the type of stuff that you need to make sure that those consent forms are right. And there are years and years and years of clear and conspicuous disclosures type of case laws or case law that explains what clear and conspicuous is. But at the very heart of it, if a reasonable consumer is reading that, they need to understand what's going to be the result of them filling out those lead forms. Rich and I had already talked about contracts. In him mentioning about defining what lead fraud is, he had mentioned a client that used the Anura standard for that. So, having something like that in your contracts that defines the types of leads that you'll accept from the lead generators and the types that you won't accept, that you won't pay for, and then making sure you have a standard that you can measure against. Obviously, we've been talking about the lead fraud detection solutions like Anura. Those are the types of things that are very helpful for this. And, if you ever do have to support in court, either because you're not going to pay the lead generator for the leads that were provided that didn't fit what was the requirement within the contract, having something to prove that will be very helpful. But then even more importantly, having something that is a stopgap measure that if the leads aren't as you had thought they were going to be and they're fraudulent leads, then you need to be able to find a way to stop those pretty quickly. And Anura is certainly one of those solutions out there for doing that. And then, with record keeping, the laws out there on telemarketing require that you keep records that establish that you have consent to make those types of telephone calls. And ultimately, it's going to be, up to the seller if they are accepting either call traffic or and there's a potential for vicarious liability there. And we could spend a whole webinar talking about that and go to our website. We have plenty on that. But either, a vicarious liability theory, if you're not the ones making the telephone calls, but somebody's making them on your behalf, It's basically one of those things that if you were aware that it's going on, or you knew or should have known that lead fraud was going on and they were making those calls on your behalf, there certainly can be liability under a common law agency theory. So something you really need to be careful with. But then if you're the ones placing the calls after purchasing leads, then there's direct liability under the TCPA and TSR and the state telemarketing laws for making those calls without consent. So make sure you have records to be able to establish that, because the best way to avoid TCPA litigation is be able to respond to it immediately with a valid lead to show plaintiff's counsel that there was valid consent for making those types of telephone calls. And then I really cannot stress enough the importance of auditing. And if you find a problem, you got to deal with it immediately and remediate that, because once you are aware of that problem and you continue to work with that company or to place calls using that information, then that's certainly going to cause you issues should you end up in a lawsuit. So really can't emphasize the importance of that. And so what do you think? Is there an acceptable level of fraud out there, Rich, when companies are looking at lead generation? Is that something they should just expect? What are your thoughts on that?
Unfortunately, you should not accept any level of fraud.
Yeah.
I know some people will, when we talk to people, they will accept a certain amount of fraud, but unfortunately, you really shouldn't accept any. Especially on the lead generation space, because even one bad lead can take you down to lawsuit case, and you don't want that. So
Yeah.
you got to do your best efforts to mitigate and eliminate any potential issues that you can run down. Um, and there's several tools that people need. Like, you want to make sure you have your consent tools in place. You want to make sure you're hitting up your DNC lists. You want to make sure, and at the end of the day, you want to make sure the real people are filling out your form. It's going to give you a higher ROI across the board. And it's going to give you some useful information as to where you should be buying your traffic from. So if you're buying from a lead generator and you got 5 or 6 lead generators you're buying from, and you can quickly identify, wow, this lead generator's got 80% of his traffic is fraud, working with them. If it's 50%, I mean, it's a business decision. You got to make a decision. Or do you just block them, or you just just choose not to work with them? But you got to keep your eye on it. Like, again, this is a big problem. It's a problem that everybody's having, whether they want to talk about it or not. It's there. 140 billion. We're all affected. So we got to figure out the best way to mitigate that.
Yeah. We've got some more questions that have come in. This is our contact information. Obviously, feel free to reach out to us at any time. But let's go ahead and go through some of these questions that have come in. So one of these, and I think this is an interesting and it's a good question to ask, are wiretapping lawsuits an issue with the solution? Has anyone sued you in California? And obviously, California has an issue with SIPA. Which is their law that prohibits the recording of telephone calls, basically, without the consent of the consumer. And the damages are pretty high, 5,000 per call. So that can get pretty significant pretty quickly. And so with the type of technology that you're looking at, Rich, do you recommend that people get consent if they're using it on their website, or how are you handling that?
Yeah, so we haven't been sued by any company. In fact, the data we're collecting is the same data that you give to every web server that you connect to around the world. So if you connect to a web server around the world, they don't all have consent to collect IP address, user agent, all the different pieces of information that we're collecting. So it's not like we're actually watching what you're doing, where I know some of the consent technologies are up for wiretapping lawsuits because they're recording, putting information in, putting their PII in, like all that stuff is recorded. We're
Yeah.
looking at the session. So when the visitor lands, how do they connect? And it's stuff that the web servers it has been asking since the dawn of the internet. Obviously, over time, it's been asking more and more information. Browser connections, all kinds of stuff has been looked at, but should not have any issues with that. I believe we've read through our lawyers have read through that stuff, and it's not an issue for us because of the way we collect the data.
Fantastic. I'm sure you get that question a lot. Somebody asked if they'll be able to get a copy of the slide deck. Certainly go to our website, mslawgroup.com, and a copy of that will be here. I'm sure we'll provide it to Rich too for his ability to do that as well. So we're asked, one of the questions is, what kind of ROI are your clients seeing when they use your product? Is there an average range?
Good question. Well, the more they spend, the bigger the ROI, is the best way to look at it. So typically what we do is we try to talk to people and find out exactly how much you're spending in digital marketing, and not everybody knows what they're spending. So we typically look at it like, all right, how many clicks are you generating a month? We know that the global average is of $2 to generate a single visitor. Some verticals a lot higher, some verticals a little less. And then we can do the math on it. So like, just take the average person. Let's just take, not the average person. Let's say somebody's spending $1 million a month in lead generation, right? And we catch 25% fraud. So that's $250,000 a month being lost to fraud, and our product will cost a couple $1,000. So the ROI is really high on that. Usually what we do is part of our sales process is the ROI. So what we like to do is we do a free trial up front just to get a gauge on how much fraud they're dealing with, so we can understand what the ROI looks like, so it makes sense to them from a financial standpoint to move forward with us.
Yeah. So somebody suggested that we do a future webinar on what percentage of TCPA lawsuits filed involve lead fraud. That would be interesting. I don't know if anybody's keeping any of those types of statistics, but it sure would be interesting to keep them. And I think it might be difficult from the public information on the case filings to be able to determine that. Obviously, in complaints, they allege various things have happened, but then actually proving that is somewhat difficult, and you probably never get an answer to that. But I think you probably would be able to look at statistics of, what allegations were out there around those types of things. But even the difficulty with that is, a plaintiff is not going to make an allegation probably of lead fraud unless they're suing the lead generator. They want to be able to just demonstrate that the call was made by somebody who didn't have consent, and they're not really concerned about all the details. They just want you to be able to prove consent. So that might be a very difficult statistic to be able to come up with, but it would be interesting. I guess you'd have to reach out and contact the companies after those cases were finished and outside of the time to appeal. Really get those types of statistics. Well, Rich, is there anything else you think we should talk about before we wrap things up?
I think that's good. It's like I said, just it's important to a topic that people need to look at and understand, and if it makes sense, start looking at your own stuff, how you're buying stuff, and go from there.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and thanks for educating folks. We appreciate it, and look forward to doing it again with you sometime soon.
Awesome. Appreciate the time.
All
Thanks.
right, take care.